Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills, and today we have Emano Olmi's 1978 feature epic, The Tree of Wooden Clogs. Now, strangely enough, I am kind of reviewing this because it's coming out on Criterion, but I actually had heard of this film before I was going to do it for that sort of thing. And the reason for that is that a friend showed me this list by the Vatican. Yes, the city-state Christian place. I've actually been there myself. I, of course, saw the Sistine Chapel there. Just amazing. Unbelievable. I think that that line from Good Will Hunting always resonates with me, even though I'm not like absolutely huge on the film, where Robin Williams talks to Matt Damon about, you know, how he could read all about the Sistine Chapel, but he can never like be inside there. And I'm like, with the... But enough sidetracking on that. My friend showed me this list by the Vatican called 45 Great Films, and I was like, oh, I see, this is gonna be shit. But actually there's some really good features on there. I would highly recommend checking it out. It's actually like a really in-depth list. They've got stuff like Andrei Rublev. They've got Dersu Uzala, the Russian-Japanese Kurosawa film that is just fantastic, and a very underrated film from him. But basically this film's on there, which is the only reason I'd heard about it, and it isn't particularly popular from what I've seen. I mean, it rates pretty well on the film sites I've used, but it's not particularly like widely appreciated or anything, which doesn't really surprise me, to be honest. And as I'll kind of go into a bit later, there's a very like specific audience for this film, and I could see lots of people just really, I wouldn't say not getting it, but just not getting into it, or just not really enjoying it. And that's totally understandable. And I could totally accept someone just not enjoying this film, because it's definitely not for everyone. And generally when I kind of give that sort of advice, it's for something like Salo or something, where it's some like crazy, super out there weird thing. But for this, it's just a very long and slow film. You have to be in a very distinct mindset to watch it. This film is 3 hours and 5 minutes long, and I generally don't have an issue with longer films. And I'm talking films like past 2.5, past 3.5 hours, and generally they kind of span out like epics, and they start a little slow because they have to establish generally a lot of characters, a lot of different subplots, but they really pick up the pace later on. I think The Godfather's a really good example of that. Another one would be Yi or A Brighter Summer Day, where those films, while being 3 hours, or A Brighter Summer Day being 4 hours, really do not feel their length. However, this film, not so much as a criticism, because this is kind of the effect it's going for, but it definitely does feel its length. And the reason for that is because it follows this very near-realist, and that's not surprising considering that this film is Italian, style where it's very natural. There's all non-professional actors, these real farmers that actually deliver these just fantastic performances. And it's a very simple kind of family drama story that really doesn't have a lot of complexity to it. And that doesn't mean that it's simplistic, it's just simple. And I think the issue for me, and what would be an issue for a lot of people, is that all of those neo-realist films that it quite obviously is borrowing from, and yet again, I'll be going into that a little bit later in terms of what it seems to be referencing, but those films are generally under 90 minutes. You know, you look at like Germany Year Zero is like 70 minutes, Bicycle Thieves is like 88 minutes, Rome Open City is like an hour and a half, just plus. They all sit around that like 90-minute feature length zone. But it's kind of strange for this, where it's like a little bit over 3 hours, you know, like double that length. But it keeps that same very like lethargic, slow, naturalist pace. And the reason it can kind of keep that up is because it replaces, you know, the usual one family, like in Bicycle Thieves, with 3 families, and they all kind of interact in this farm setting. And for that reason, I got a fair few like different vibes from different filmmakers here. I was getting some like Tarkovsky vibes throughout the whole film, mainly because it reminds me so much of his Italian-produced film Nostalgia, which of course he made after he defected from the Russians. God, I still can't believe that that's a thing. And a lot of that like beautiful, luscious green cinematography comes through, as well as the fact that that like 70s film stock just has that certain kind of like uncolor graded, washed out look. And that's not a criticism, of course, it just has that like feel to it, and I really like that feel. On top of that, I was getting some Bela Tarr vibes a little bit from this, bit of Southern Tango, and I think I've referenced Southern Tango as an outside film in just about every single review I ever talked about. I always managed to like worm it in some way into all my videos. But I was kind of getting that like rural townspeople who are all kind of illiterate and not so much afraid of technology or of like alternate ideology to this orthodox Christian one. But there's this definite sense of like, we are in an isolationist enclosed space, and these alien ideas and technologies, while not inherently evil, are kind of like penetrating this inner sanctuary, and it's all a little bit weird. And that kind of becomes like the central focus of this film, particularly at the end. There are little hints at it throughout the film, particularly this one subplot about this couple that gets married, and they're talking to this priest and saying, oh, you know, we're going to go for a honeymoon somewhere in Italy. He's saying, you know, keep your faith and beware of these modern ideals, you know, do not be sucked into them. They're new, they're different, and that really takes charge, because the last like 40 minutes of this film is just them in Italy, and you see these like political prisoners being arrested, and there's like armed guards on the street, and it's all very in your face. And really like that we get to sit in this isolated farm setting for almost like 2.5 hours, which kind of replicates these people's lives sitting in this one setting this whole time. And then we're like jarringly thrown into this crazy, busy, and this very, very different like city setting, and it's just a wonderful like charge towards the end. And that really seemed to like revitalize my love for this film, and I think it has a very, very strong ending in that regard. Because for the first maybe hour and a bit, it really, really takes its time setting up, and I was getting a little bit worried about the pacing, but payoffs do start to come in very, very quickly after that period, and it just ramps up in quality from there. As a side note, I mentioned that it has these like neo-realist tendencies, and by that I mean you have some staples of that movement where you have non-professional actors, e.g. real farmers playing farm characters, and I mean that's just the most natural and real way you can get a performance, is by literally getting someone who is a non-actor, who is actually in that profession, to act in your film. And I suspected that this was the case when I was watching it, but of course I confirmed later that of course they were non-actors, but they do a really, really good job of selling these performances. On top of that, lots of very, very static, straight or just panning and tracking movements, and just a pretty like long average shot length, and just very like fluid editing that really lets you sit with these people for some time. But the film really takes realism to another extent by actually killing animals on screen. So there's a scene basically where this farmer just grabs a goose and then just decapitates it, and I kind of went, oh, okay, was that real? I'm not sure. And it happened so quickly I wasn't sure if it was like a dummy or something, or if it was a model, but I was like, okay, that's interesting. I wonder if they actually did it. And my suspicions were confirmed later on when they literally bloodlet a pig, which basically means that they cut into the artery in its neck and then bleed it out into a bucket. And they all actually did this on screen, which should also serve as a warning to people who don't want to see that. There is the literal killing and then gutting of a pig. They fully just pull out all of its internal organs. I find that really, really fascinating, and I love that they actually did that for the film. And there's a kind of similar filmic experience that this reminds me of, which is Stan Brackage's The Act of Seeing with One's Own Eyes. I watched that when I was quite young and getting into film, and I basically said, what's the most obscure, ridiculous thing I could possibly find? And I found this film, and Brackage is now one of my favorite filmmakers. I would highly, highly recommend buying the Criterion Brackage collection. He just makes some of the most like visually stunning experimental films I think I've ever seen. But basically, The Act of Seeing with One's Own Eyes is a roughly 40-minute, completely silent autopsy video where we see 3 real autopsies being played out on camera. And it's just a fascinating experiment where you're just viewing people just pulling apart these bodies just in real time, and it's all just right there in the forefront of the film. And obviously that film's quite experimental, and here it's more for like the purpose of showing realism. But I think that also kind of ties into that neo-realist idea of just being like unflinching in your depiction of sorrow, sadness, death, whatever, and just kind of showing it without these like psychological angles. You know, if we see someone crying on film, the immediate response a la D.W. Griffith's like camera laws is to go for the close-up, to get that emotionality, to get right up there in someone's face. But I really like that this film, kind of like Tar's films, intentionally doesn't use those like manipulative camera angles. And that's not saying that that type of shot is bad, because it just makes sense in terms of film language. But I like that they intentionally broke that really, really solid and ingrained rule simply to thematically fit in with that idea of this unflinching resolve and just kind of showing life very, very plainly. On a technical level, I think I mentioned before, this reminds me of a Tarkovsky film. While it doesn't have the visual prowess that he has, obviously it's a little bit hard to top Tarkovsky in terms of that, so I'm not trying to compare those films exactly on that level, but this is still a visually very beautiful film. And while it doesn't have, like I was saying, the visual prowess of Tarkovsky in terms of the crazy tracking shots or just the beautiful framing, just sitting in this natural Italian countryside is just It just looks really nice. Plus the soundtrack here is really great, and yet again, getting some Bela Tarr vibes and the kind of strained church organ music, and it's just very like melancholic and kind of sorrowful at the same time. And in terms of visual design as well, this film is very, very slow, like I was saying, but occasionally it will just do something really, really interesting for the period. And one of those times is where this mother is throwing down this washing to her kids below, and every time she throws one down, it immediately like jump cuts back up to her, and it's just this like really interesting technique that just comes out of nowhere. And I'm not sure how many films, especially this type of film, would have been doing that at the time. It's just a really interesting, like, whoa, okay, you're doing that now. It just seems very ahead of its time for like this late 1970s neo-realist Italian film. I mentioned that this film appears on the Vatican's Top 45 Great Films, and in that it actually appears under the subcategory of values. And it's kind of easy to see why. Yes, this film does have some pretty heavy Christian themes in it, but mainly it just kind of follows family values and kind of sticking to certain principles. And to go into spoilers now to mention this, and of course, if you haven't seen this and you want to see this, and I would recommend this film, of course, then basically click here and it will take you to the end of this video for my conclusive points, which will also be non-spoilerish. So basically you can just skip that section that will spoil the film, and wow. So as I was saying, basically it kind of creates this conflict of values where there's these two separate subplots where in one, this old man finds a gold coin on the ground during this festival, and basically he kind of goes over to it, looks around, and then takes it and basically steals it. And of course, as a poor farmer, this means a whole deal to him, but at the same time he's also stealing from someone, but then at the same time it was on the ground and no one was looking for it, so you have this kind of mild conflict here. But ultimately, and very strangely, and I'm not really sure why he does this, he hides the coin under dirt in a horse's hoof, and then later loses it, of course, because like, why on earth would you put that there? That's like the worst place to hide something, especially something as small as like a gold coin. Like, couldn't you have just hidden it under your bed or something? Like, what? And basically he eventually loses that, of course, because he hid it under a fucking horse's hoof. Like, what are you thinking? And after that, it's kind of implied he goes slightly mad from that experience where he's like, oh, he's kind of beating the horse, which also reminds me, of course, of the Turin Horse, which is about the horse that Nietzsche beats right before he goes mad. And I'm not sure if that's meant to be a reference to that at all, because there aren't any other like Nietzschean themes or anything really in the film as far as I'm aware. So then as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, okay, this guy's stolen something for his own personal greed and he's lost it, and he gets the repercussions of that, like karma, that he kind of goes a bit mad. But then there's this other subplot in family where they're sending their little kid to school and he has to walk like 6 kilometers a day to get there, and he's the only one basically in the entire town getting an education, and they have very, very high hopes for him. And there's this great scene, and as I was mentioning, it's kind of like these alien ideas and technologies coming back to them, and this kid is describing what he's learned about microbial bacteria in water, and his family are like, my god, animals that small, how do they fit in water? And it's just this wonderful sequence. But basically, and as a reference to the title of this film, the boy breaks one of his wooden clogs when he's walking back, and the father basically has to go cut down a tree from land that isn't his, and one that is presumably owned by some wealthy person who kind of owns the entire town that they're living in. From memory, that really isn't established that well, but that's just kind of the vibe I got from that. And he uses that wood from the tree to basically make his son another wooden clog so he can go to school. And the thing is here, it's like, okay, you've stolen, but the difference between you and the gold coin man is that you're doing it for a good cause. So the conflict here, of course, is should you do a bad thing for a good reason? And the end result of that is this wealthy landowner finds out and basically just really harshly punishes this family and just kind of kicks them out of this whole complex and takes almost all their possessions. And that's the ending of the film, is just them kind of riding off into the darkness with this uncertainty. And if you've seen the film Bicycle Thieves, this has almost an identical ending / tone to it. This kind of obsession with uncertainty is a really central staple of neorealism for me. The sense of great tragedy and loss, and then cut to credits, and you're just kind of left with this sensation that that's going to be the impetus for further tragedies and further horror down the road. And I like that it kind of has that horror principle of more is less, where we can almost extrapolate what's going to happen to that family in our heads. We know that with nothing, they're basically going to be poor and possibly end up dying from that level of poverty. And in that sense, it leaves it up to our kind of imagination for that to be so horrible. And of course, as I was saying, horror uses that technique quite a bit, particularly through like sound design, where not fully seeing the murder or not fully seeing the gore is far worse than seeing it, plainly in broad daylight with nothing around, which, tying back of course to Brackich's film, is almost exactly what that's about, where you're seeing this horrific gore, but it's just shown plainly. That's the same with the gunning of the pig. You know, it's like screaming horribly as they're slitting its throat, and it's just shown in this flat angle, and the farmers have just done this a million times, and they're just kind of going about their job. And it's not as if this ending is melodramatic because it is sad and it's kind of shot to be sad, but I think it's very effective for that reason, in that the film kind of abstains from that manipulation for some time, and then just really kicks you hard at the end when you go, wow, it's really unjust that this family is treated horribly. You know, their son will no longer be able to go to school and possibly have a much, much brighter future than his family's. So it's almost like a test of faith in that sense, where it's like these people are pious religiously and they're really nice people, and then they just have, through mankind's actions, this horrible fate happen to them. And I feel like just generally that's kind of this like nihilistic idea of just randomness, that just any time of any day some like horrifically unexpected event can happen to you. You know, you could be walking down the street and then just be clobbered over the head by some random person and die from internal injury. And then that's like, that's it. It doesn't matter about the piousness of your life. It doesn't matter how good a person you were, in the same sense that some horrible people fucking win the lottery. I guess that is kind of like projecting slightly because the film isn't necessarily about that, but that just kind of seems like the next logical step, and that's where more of the Bela Tarr vibes come from, because his films are more explicitly about that and have that very similar style of just kind of showing everything in full. And just before I give a score, there's a few shots I just kind of want to draw attention to. I love this shot really, really near the end of the film. This is probably in the last like 10 shots of this film, and also it kind of funnily enough coincides with the Criterion cover art for this film, where it's centered on this frame on this boy, and I love that he is isolated compared to the rest of this family, because he of course is the boy that's getting an education, and he is distinctly separated from these people, but then he kind of gets lumped back in with them at the end, and he's kind of like pulled back to earth with them. And I'm not certain if that was the intended effect of that framing, but if it is highly effective and very, very subtle. Second shot I want to draw attention to is this one that reminds me quite a bit of a shot in Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom. It might just be the fact that both take place in a monastery and that's how the tables look, but it's something about the tone of this scene as well that just really reminds me of that scene too. And yeah, that's about it. For me, this is an 86 out of 100. I absolutely adore this film. I would highly recommend it to very certain people, and of course it's a little difficult to judge who exactly would like this film. If you like a lot of the neo-realist films, you will probably enjoy this, but of course I can't guarantee it. And in saying that, it's not the sort of film I would possibly be wanting to watch for another couple of years. It's the sort of experience where you watch it once and then almost forget about it and then watch it again, because it's such a long and slow process to sit through it. And not only because of the pretty long runtime, but just the way in which the film is paced and shot and so on. So of course this comes with a guided recommendation, and I totally understand if you would not enjoy this film, but I really love it. It's pretty great, and I'm definitely going to check out Olney's other stuff. I actually failed to mention that this won the Palme d'Or and a bunch of other awards in 1978, which was also surprising to me that this didn't have a larger audience. So hopefully with the upcoming Criterion release, it'll get a little bit more attention, which will be great for it, because I love spreading the love of that film. Yeah, boy. And that's it. You can check out my other stuff down there. I mentioned Bicycle Thieves a couple of times, and this film reminds me quite heavily of that film. You can check out a review I did of that film, which I shot in Italy. How is that? That's crazy. I mentioned Bela Tarr a few times, of course. Did a video essay on Bela Tarr titled Transcending the Void, which may be the most pretentious title you could possibly come up with. I try. Check that stuff out. Like and subscribe, all that jazz, and yeah. Toodle-doo.